Thanks very much, everybody. And I'd like to acknowledge my fellow group members here. Annika is actually on the group as well as my colleagues from engineering and from math, and obviously the support from WeSpark. Just waiting for that first slide. Um, Great. Yeah, Michael, if you could go to the next slide, that's fine. Right. So, what are we doing? Our group was put together to look at a sort of an interesting research and sort of general question in which some of you have already raised, like Sarah and Lyra talked about the city. And the idea is how resilient is infrastructure with respect to pandemic management? And we know from the news that pandemic impacts have varied by country and even by city. And it's hard to say that simple characteristics such as city size and population size explain all the differences. They don't. There are some unique factors. And so, are there specific municipal characteristics that allow a community to first withstand a pandemic and then return to some sort of functionality faster? As we've said, it's not the normal, it's a new normal, but at least some sort of functional state. Can we get the next slide, please, Mike? So what's the context? First of all, cities and the community are the level which we interact. Nations and provinces will set the big picture, but then we have to figure out how we do that. And of course, we realize that there's a difference. Like large cities like Montreal, they experienced some of the worst outbreaks, but at the same time, assuming everything else is running, they have the resources to say withstand a pandemic. Small communities, the rural communities, they don't want you there because they're more likely going to get it because they're concerned that if they do get it, they're going to be overwhelmed. And we saw the situation out in Alberta with the meat packing communities. We also had on this idea that there's a municipal state of emergency for governments. And of course, we know a lot of cities have enacted climate change emergencies, which allows them to focus. So how does this all play into this thing? Well, as we've heard from a number of people, different demographic groups interact differently with municipal infrastructures and systems. And vulnerable populations, or those, say, with lower income, depend significantly on infrastructure systems and services. So transit is is one of the best examples. Do we, for example, shut transit down? Do we limit transit? Because those are possible ways that we can transmit the disease. But of course, then people will be impacted differently, and some may not have the options that those of us, say, with vehicles do have. But there's a few other interesting dynamics. For example, unlike an environmental disaster, in this case, assuming everything is running, we can choose how to govern a system. That doesn't usually happen. If we have a flood and a roadway is taken out or the power is taken out, we have to deal with it, and it can be unpredictable. But now we have some choices. And we heard a lot about, like Sarah, for example, walkable city. So these all start to come into play in terms of the infrastructure. Interesting example, which was just brought up to me, is heat crises and heat alerts. Municipalities generally advise their citizens to go to large public facilities with air conditioning commercial establishments. We don't have that option during this pandemic. So that adds another interesting dimension. And of course, the situation is, what if a major system is also disrupted? Can you imagine going through the last 16 weeks if power was shut off on a constant basis, if clean drinking water was disrupted? It would be a completely different, and I'd say much more significantly harder challenge to cope with. So the idea is what we're trying to do is figure out, are there preferred characteristics or actions by municipalities and its populations to improve their resiliency to respond and to recover from future pandemic scenarios? Last slide, please, Michael. And so we can think about it in a few ways. And I use this 3 diagram saying my background is sustainability. So let's go with 3. So we have infrastructure, systems and services, governance in terms of management and regulations, and community in terms of population groups and dynamics. So what are we seeing here? The infrastructure, the intersection between infrastructure and governance tells us what is, say, maybe acceptable or permittable. The intersection between infrastructure and community tells us what might be viable or possible. So viable or feasible. But the intersection between governance and community then may tell us what is equitable or fair. And so when we intersect all these 3, we have the idea that, hey, maybe our infrastructure then is truly resilient, both during a pandemic and after a pandemic, and the way the world is going, probably future pandemics. That's all I have. Thanks very much.